Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Deeply Graphic Design Cast. I'm Nick Longo, another solo one. I promise you, Mikkel and I, we're talking today. We are going to get our holiday gift guide episode. The tradition continues. That will be coming up next. But in the meantime, I wanted to drop in a quick one. Something I've been noticing a lot lately, and that is nostalgia. Nostalgia in branding, nostalgia in packaging, in all of these areas that I think we look for inspiration and checking things out on Pinterest or on Dribbble or on Behance. And, as a designer who's been working in branding and packaging for most of my career, it is really incredible to see this trend just stay. It's not a trend that seems to like come and go. What's interesting about nostalgia, it seems to be sticking around in a lot of the things that we are looking for. And I think there's a lot of good reason for that. A lot of times when you think about brands or designs that are nostalgic to begin with, they do kind of go back to a certain day or a certain time or a certain period and give you that feeling of kind of comfort or that feeling of familiarity. And I've used it a lot. And I think a lot of times too, it might be my default sometimes, right? When you are doing something new or working with a new client. But one of the things I love about it is if it's something that you and the client are already talking about, and it does make sense to apply that to a new brand or a new design or anything you're creating, it does have this beautiful kind of storytelling quality about it, and we'll dive into it a lot more. But I just love the idea of what it does. And one of the things I want to find really quickly was I had forgot to look this up, but I'm sure you guys all remember we've talked about Mad Men. It's that perfect kind of show that I know a lot of designers loved. But there was a quote that was so amazing that Don Draper said about nostalgia. I'm pretty sure it was the carousel episode where they were putting together a pitch for the carousel slide projector. Can't remember if they actually used Kodak in there or not, but you get the picture. Here's what he said: nostalgia. It's delicate but potent. Teddy told me that in Greek, nostalgia literally means the pain from an old wound. It's a twinge in your heart, far more powerful than memory alone. This device isn't a spaceship, it's a time machine. It goes backwards and forwards. It takes us to the place where we ache to go again. It's not called the wheel, it's called the carousel. Wow. Like, gosh, I think when I first saw that episode, one, I was already hooked, on that episode, and that series in general, just so incredible. But their ability to show pitches and presentations on that show were always what gravitated to me the best. Like that to me was just unbelievable. But I love that idea of it makes you think back to a time that you ache to relive again or to feel again. And I think that's why we're so drawn to these retro designs. It could be the beautiful color palettes. I think most of you can realize too, like you see that color palette first and it automatically connects to a retro nostalgic feel. There's also the typography choices. I love the typography parts the best because I feel like with most of the stuff I'm currently working on, if it's a modern, fresh kind of approach, there's so many to choose from. But when you're in that world of nostalgia, it kind of really funnels down some of the best font choices because of its era and what that typography represents about that time. Or it just might be the vibe itself. And there's something really, really comfortable and comforting about it. In the past few years, comfort is exactly, I think, what people have been craving. So this idea of seeing it happen and used so much, and people talking about it as a trend, I believe it's a little bit more than that. And it's something that's a little bit more essential and we'll probably see in so many different shapes and forms over the future that'll always be there. And who knows, in 20, 30 years, what does nostalgia look like? It could be going back to something that we're doing right now. So nostalgia is that ever changing kind of trend or feeling that might happen and we might be using for a long time, which is pretty cool. So, what could we explore when it comes to nostalgia? The way it works in branding, primarily. It works so well because it's a bit of like psychology. And those of you who have listened to a lot of our past episodes and you probably have incorporated this into your own process, is that idea of doing all of that discovery and trying to tap in and pull at the emotional strings of someone's kind of what they believe in, what they love, what are those things that attract them, what are the things that are going to help pull and someone into that kind of particular thing. And there's something so cool about nostalgia because it taps into one, your emotions. It also reminds us of simpler times, and I think in these days that's just probably something we all want to kind of like put into our branding and some of our designs. And if you're a product offering something, you want to remind people of simpler times. And what better way to do it than in packaging, branding, and all of these things that we're going to talk about. It also reminds you of maybe a happy memory. But the one thing that I was doing some research on that I think it really does pull from, or the thing that it really is tapping into, and that is something that maybe we've trusted in the past. And I remember someone showing me like two designs they were working on, and one was very future driven and very kind of high tech, and it had that modern aesthetic to it. And the next one next to it was a little bit more nostalgic, a little bit more retro and vintage. And I'll never forget the client was saying, I want to go with number two because I want to look more trusted. The other one looks like it's brand new. And for the topic, or I forget what the actual product offering was at that time, but the client was really kind of driven to make sure that this looked more like a trusted brand and something that had been around for a long time if you're going to make that decision and maybe purchase that brand. So I thought that was a really interesting thing, and that emotional connection that you want to create or build with is pure gold when it comes to branding, design, and anything in this fashion. When someone looks at a product and it sparks that feeling of some kind of a familiarity or comfort, they'll most likely pick it or they'll most likely trust it, because I think that's again one of those things that it does. The first little area I want to chat about is emotional connection. And so much research has shown that nostalgia will evoke a positive emotion and make people feel safe. If that's your goal, if that's something you want to do, particularly with a new brand that's debuting, I think that's another reason why we're seeing this so much is there's so many new brands and they tend to go in this nostalgic vintage area because of that. They want people to feel safe in choosing that brand. And that brand, man, it could lead to a stronger loyalty and increased sales if it really does work. And the fact that we're not seeing it as a trend that will come and go, could that mean these nostalgic brands or nostalgic packaging, whatever it might be, can actually stand the test of time that way because we're not expecting it to grow up or change? So that's the emotional connection I think nostalgia plays with branding and packaging. Number two is the universal appeal. Nostalgia works across generations. Boomers feel it because it's connected to their childhood in some way, while millennials and maybe even Gen Z connect to this retro aesthetic, and it's reinforced through media and design and anywhere else you're going to see it. So in both cases, in both audiences, there is a universal appeal with that. It might even, if you've never experienced it and it feels even more nostalgic than something you actually remember as a kid, that's even going further back in time. And so that idea of universal appeal is something I've been using. And I think the Little Billy's project that I got to share with you guys a few months ago is a perfect example of that. A brand new company, a brand new brand, a brand new restaurant in a very existing location in Southern California. What was their way of doing that? And I think that idea of universal appeal, they're seeing every age group attract to this thing because it's comforting. It gives them a sense of feeling safe and trusted. So So cool to see how that's working. And this third one, well, I just said it, is the trust factor. If something is familiar, if a design or an aesthetic about what you're looking at is familiar, it can make the product or the offering feel more reliable. And in a world where it's a brand new decision or a brand new offering, wouldn't the fact that it feeling reliable right from the very beginning, before the person's even made the decision of buying it, purchasing it, subscribing to it, whatever it might be, that helps the brand kind of bridge that gap between the past and the present. So it's no wonder that we're tapping into this so much more than ever because it's working. And, there might be a downfall. I don't know. I can't predict the future. I can see that this is one of those things that is not really a trend. It is a whole new area to continue to go backwards on and make people feel that it's trusted, make people feel that there's a universal appeal, and all of these things that kind of help that emotional connection. We are storytellers, right? Like, how many times do we talk about that in everything we do? From the projects we create to the social media stuff that we play on all of our different accounts, it has to tell a bit of a story. And this is one of those things that I really think is working on it. Certain industries are exceptionally good at this, for sure. I think the food and beverage area, for example, is really just killing it. Think of these old school cereal boxes or soda cans that you used to see as a kid, and seeing those slowly come back in that soda world. Wow, that's really being seen with a lot of these new brands, because I think they want to be the new soda. Like, soda has a bad kind of connotation of it being sugary and a lot of questionable ingredients in it. Whereas everyone's trying to make these more healthier sodas. Of course, they're going to, majority of them have went with this kind of nostalgic, retro, vintage vibe for all the reasons we just talked about. But these designs aren't just the packaging. They're these memories of the past that you might want to connect with the new one. So it's so neat to see how that's working. I think fashion, for sure, is that second area, is a super big one where nostalgia will always play a role. We're always doing a throwback. We're always doing that. And that throwback, like I said earlier, changes with time. So, in 2040, will we be going back to the 2020s as a unique thing? Is the look of today, and is there a look of today? Is everything kind of nostalgic and a throwback in a lot of ways? It kind of makes you question a lot of that stuff, but we're seeing this like 90s inspired branding come back. And a lot of people were saying, when I asked around, why do you think that 90s and the Y2K thing really came back? And a lot of people were saying, well, it's packaging up everything you loved about that era and bringing it back in a fresh new time. And again, it stands out. If you were the first to kind of get into that zone, a lot of that 90s stuff really stood out, 6, 7 months ago. But again, that's a 90s trend, not so much I would call it a nostalgia trend. It's so specific of that one time. Whereas nostalgia just feels like trusted and mass appeal. That 90s thing was a little bit more targeted to that specific area of uniqueness. So maybe that's why we're seeing it kind of like, I'm seeing a lot of people saying, like, if I see that again, I'm out. So I agree. I'm seeing it way too much. But let's talk about two brands that I think really made an incredible impact in what they did with nostalgia, primarily in their last rebrands, which is kind of cool. So let me get this up here, and hopefully you guys are watching on one of our video offerings, which would be on either Spotify or on YouTube. So let me get this going, and I'm going to show you some really cool stuff here that I thought was worth showing. So our first brand that we want to go to for sure is Chobani. And we all have admired this. I got a chance to even meet the team that did the rebrand of this at the Expo West food show a few years back. And I was with a bunch of my students, and they all loved it because it was like we got to kind of pick their brains a little bit on everything here. But you just look at this Chobani refresh logo from before to after, and everything there tells you what we're probably going to talk about in the remainder of this case study. But look at that old type. It was a little techie. I can't remember the name of it. I believe I even had it on a on a computer a long time ago. I forget the name of it, but all caps, not a lot of soul, not a lot of like appetizing vibe to it. In fact, considering that was a food brand, it's pretty interesting to think that they got through a few years with that. Now you switch to the new one, and I love the idea of this curved type and this like serifed kind of rounded vibe. It gave such a familiarity and a feeling of comfort and all the right things we talked about. Just in the logo type and the word mark alone is they killed it, right? And I think someone in the design team mentioned that if you look at those serifs, they kind of reminded you of like yogurt, right? Like they kind of reminded you of soft kind of like curvatures. And if you were to look at it, like it kind of resembled that kind of vibe, which I thought was really, really cool. Look at the old brand. Wow. It's so funny that we didn't even see this when you looked at this. You just thought, oh, that's Chobani on the shelves, right? Then they come up with this new one, all this beautiful new typography. The color palettes alone just took it to nostalgia like city, right? Beautiful muted colors. They had the primary ones were all in this kind of zone of pale. But then look at to the right, you've got these pops of colors that were going to be used for particular areas that where it needed to have a little bit more color and a little bit more pop. So it's really right from the beginning, they figured it out. And even in their photography, they found a way to have this aged kind of like old Polaroid, high contrast, vivid kind of bright vibrancy within there. A lot of texture showing in all of the different food and the elements. I think this was a great beginning of seeing so many other brands now kind of maybe play the copycat a little bit, but also just be inspired by it and saying like, wow, photography could have a style. The photography of our brand could have its own look and feel that we will carry across. And there's a certain bit of like, now you're building up a bit of the brands has this responsibility to be this way everywhere you're going to see it. So it wasn't picture perfect. It was a little bit aged and a little bit sun drenched. It had a lot of that beautiful vibe to it. And then as you go through more and more, you can see how they used it. You can see there was this like hyper realistic, but also grainy texture in a lot of the stuff. The organic vibe of their icons and all of their art was done. It looks like the same artist did everything. Like to me, that was one of the best things I noticed when we first looked at this thing back a few years ago. And boy, has this, stood the test of time here. The idea here is like, it's not only, I think one of my favorites. I'm going to leave this on maybe a better image here before we talk a little bit more. Let's find something really cool here to leave it on. I think they've got some great packaging here. You can see, and then look at how it even got watercolored in the packaging, how the fruit had this like, almost from far away, it looks super realistic. And then as you get closer, you find out that it's literally like watercolor. It's just beautiful. It's probably one of my favorites for sure. The Chobani thing, when they did this a few years ago, their rebrand had this incredible retro inspired look, the earthy colors, these hand drawn illustrations. It really did feel like something from like a 1970s farmer's market. The result, probably one of the most successful, I think, in history. This thing has had such a huge, successful kind of launch, and it has stood the test of time. It's one of those rebrands that I think, will probably go down in history as probably, I think, one of the best, to be honest with you. The next one I wanted to show off was not just a nostalgia rebrand, but kind of a throwback to another time of this brand, and that was Burger King. Burger King was another great example where their recent rebrand was like this masterclass of how you can go backwards and do a retro kind of inspired vibe from the past and make it done completely right for them. They went back to their 1969 logo and they modernized it just enough. And then it was paired with this like bold, fun typography that really, not only had the retro colors that were going to work, but the whole brand feels super fresh and exciting while still leaning into that nostalgic factor. It's kind of the perfect balance. So you look back at the old one and you kind of think, wow, like that does now shout like 90s, right? The bright orange and the bright blue and the bright red, right? Look what they switched it to. Two colors, back to the old logo and with some refined things from the past. So you got this, even that aged kind of like eggshell color in the background. They no longer used white. They use that instead, and it has this beautiful nostalgia vibe, this signature little like kind of VK. I haven't actually seen it being used much. It's kind of was the funnest and the most favorite thing I remember of all the designers commenting on this years ago when they rebranded, but I just haven't seen it, or maybe I just haven't been in a Burger King to really kind of admire it. Beautiful kind of like whole kit, the identity elements showing up in one beautiful image. They even did something really cool with their photography, very similar to what Chobani did, and brought it back to life with this like older kind of like extra grain texture, you name it. I love the packaging just works so cohesively. Everything about it was really great. What a fantastic job by the JKR folks here. Look at this. Even their uniforms went back in time a little bit. It's just great. Here's a really good one. I think this one shows where it blends old with new. You got to do something, cool on their app or maybe social media and things that are going to be more digital. And here's where they really brought it together beautifully. I think seeing these new illustrations that really complement the old style, but feel a little more today and maybe a little bit more familiar. So there was this perfect kind of mix of both old and new when Burger King did this. I think this was the one area where maybe it kind of fell a little bit short. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I've never seen a brand new storefront like the one they showed here. I still see the old ones that have been basically kind of revamped and given the new logo. But I haven't seen this, and maybe this didn't go forward. I do like the lanes and the things they did on the parking lot, which I thought were fantastic. But it's almost too modern for me for this, where it didn't go full retro the way everything else did here as well. So these were my two kind of favorite little areas there. And these nostalgic brands, truly, between Chobani, I would say Burger King, and then a ton more that maybe are smaller and maybe lesser known, they really reinforce that identity of bringing wholesome back with traditional customer values and an authenticity that I think most customers of both of them really do appreciate. Burger King's strategy was, just really simply to reinforce their classic logo and bring that playful, fun visual back to life. And it's relatable. And I think it's kind of timeless. And this is so neat to see it. Why both of these work is they use that nostalgia. They use highlights from their list of values and the things that make them who they are. And Chobani got the authenticity, whereas Burger King got the playfulness. And that's making their designs feel more purposeful and not gimmicky. They actually have something to say, and they're having a blast doing it. They both have all those retro vibes that are super fun, and they're used to kind of tell a story. And that's what I think really makes nostalgia work. It has to feel meaningful. It can't just be decorative. It has to be meaningful. So what are some ways you guys can kind of experiment with this? I think there's some cool stuff here I want to show you. The first thing I wanted to show you here was this unique kind of like, this is something we talked about a while back. And this might look a little nostalgic to you, but I called this more the unconventional brand trend that was happening, and it's still happening now, where you see a lot of this stuff. It does pay a little bit of respect to this nostalgia, retro, vintage vibe. But again, this also has a bit of a modern thing, and it has some very unique and wild typography that's being inspired by it. So I wouldn't call this primarily the area of that. What I did want to show you was some of these things. This is what I feel is kind of coming back. This is nostalgia. This is playing off of the old stuff and showing you some really cool ones. Look at this Fielding Craft Cider Company. I thought this one was a really beautiful one where it brought back old vintage type and two color. It's got that eggshell that makes it look a little bit older, and some cool ones. This one was a great one I saw for Sorry Nana. It's a new pasta sauce brand. I thought they did a beautiful job by bringing in the gold along with the red and yellow, and that gold gives you vibes of like old Italian packaging. So again, they are playing off of an older era. This one here, the Sunground Coffee, another beautiful one as well. Seeing these, isn't it funny? The gold just seems to be something that's I'm trying to look at these and find out what are some common like threads throughout a lot of them. And that gold seems to be working. This one I thought was fantastic. This candy box, again, playing off watercolor, vintage vibes. Notice there's not a use of white. It's actually like an eggshell again. A beautiful way to do it. I think that shows off the nostalgia in a nice way as well. And even some of these ones that are a little bit more licensed, like this Disney one with the Mickey Mouse on it, it's a way of bringing back an old character and something cool, and yet it's still relevant to today because I feel like if it's something on food and beverage, I'm telling you, I think there's just some magic happening there as well. This Bob's Flakes I thought was an interesting one too. It's kind of a mixture of that unconventional and nostalgic as well, but it definitely plays back to an older, familiar thing there, and it really does play off of the old one. Last one here was this sparkling Everhop hop water. Again, I thought they did a beautiful job with this one as well. It pays some respect back to that old world, but it's working in today's environment. So I think there's just something so neat to see how some of these brands have really paid some respect to these old things and all the things that we love about them being familiar, being trusted, and everything. And I think they come off with a really great kind of starting point as a new brand. I think that's the whole point of what you're trying to do is show them this new brand in a fresh, trusting way. So if you want to try this, if you want to give this a shot and maybe see how this works, some of the things you can start experimenting right now in your work. First, make sure you're diving into the brand's history. If you're working on a rebrand, take a very close look and a very deep look at their old logos and maybe their old packaging and things like that. They might have old advertisements and stuff to look at. There's often some really incredible little like golden nuggets in there that you can find throughout a brand's archive. And those would be a wonderful thing to do it. Plus, wow, that's such a great way to convince or to help persuade the client or the owner of that company to play off of that idea because it's coming from something of their past. So I think that's a really unique way to start, particularly if that's a rebrand and the brand has some history to play around with that. You want to start small, experiment with maybe a limited edition retro packaging just to try and test the audience of that brand. For example, I think Coca-Cola does that a lot where they often in their holiday designs and maybe their seasonal stuff, they go back to the old logos and the old typography and the old style and feel. It's almost like a test to see, does their consumer appreciate that? Will they like that? If you are lucky enough to work with a brand that maybe has that kind of history and they're not sure if it's maybe right for a rebrand, doing a limited edition kind of like one-off, maybe seasonal, is a really great way to try and test the waters with a current client. I think that's a really fun way to do it. What you could do is you could play with some of the elements. You can look at the fonts and anything that might be retro inspired to use. Just like we've seen as well, maybe play with some muted colors of their current colors. That way there's familiarity and it feels like it's part of the family, but those muted colors might really work great for anything new you're trying. The other thing to do is try a vintage texture or maybe a grainy overlay or some kind of foil stamping. That'd be a unique way as well to play with something existing and turn it into something nostalgic and fun. The last thing I want to talk about in this little area is maybe trying to mix the old with the new. If you could combine a nostalgic kind of element with a modern touch, it keeps the design fresh and it's relevant. Very similar to what we looked at when we were looking at Burger King, the way they took their newer, fresh illustrations and kind of played off of the nostalgic branding and all of the elements in their visual identity. That is a beautiful way to take a throwback and make it work with the new stuff as well. For packaging, I think materials, maybe textures, things like craft paper. We talked about the foil stamping as well. Those are really unique ways to add something fun there. Look into maybe it's the photography and you're adding in a grainy texture or something cool to evoke that retro feel with them as well. Pair those with those warm muted colors, hand-drawn illustrations. I think that kind of stuff would make for a beautiful kind of throwback to see how does it work. So again, if you're finding a way to add this in now and something you can test, kind of get a gut check on if a client or the consumers of that client do want it, a limited edition packaging could be a really cool way to do that. A lot of brands have been doing that as well. When is nostalgia maybe not the right fit, right? Let's be real with this. Nostalgia isn't the answer for everything. It can't be that thing that over and over and over again, every brand you work with is going to be in that world, right? One big risk with it is it might be alienating the true younger audience who doesn't connect with that time period that you're trying to reference. So if it goes too far back, is that a risk with particularly if your target market is a much more younger audience? For example, if you're designing for Gen Z and you're referencing something from the 70s, they might not get the same emotional connection that I think you're hoping for. Maybe you get because that's something that is a little bit more in your era. So just make sure that when you are doing anything in that zone, you want to make sure that there's not a disconnect with the target audience. So always consider the audience. Does the era you're referencing resonate with them? And if not, you're risking losing that engagement for sure. So it might just mean moving up the years and finding something that's a little bit more resonating with that audience. The second thing too is like brand fit. Nostalgia just might clash with that brand completely, right? If a brand is known for being much more cutting edge or innovative or in the tech space, focused on the future, well then maybe nostalgia won't work. One cool little way I think you can at least exercise something is going with that kind of mid-century modern space world of like Googie and a lot of that beautiful design aesthetic from like the 50s and 60s. Like a lot of space and a lot of things were done in that zone. So is that a way to maybe try it? It could be, but for a full brand revise or refresh, I think that's where it could be a complete disconnect because the brand fit does not fit with something that is nostalgic in the first place. So just make sure it's really working good for the brand that is at hand, right? You want to obviously avoid the overuse of this as well. Overdosing on nostalgia can make designs feel tired or a bit redundant in a lot of ways, especially in a very saturated market. So one of the things I've always do is do a competitive analysis. If no one in that space is doing it, okay, worth testing the waters, seeing how the client feels in the gut check, kind of with maybe a mood board or something. If they really like the nostalgic, retro, vintage vibe for a new brand, awesome. And if it doesn't really appear in any of the competitors, I think you've got like the open door to at least try it. Now, what if that industry is just saturated with nothing but that? I would say that's probably a situation where it might not work and you're just going to be a lookalike. Whereas that might be a perfect opportunity to go completely, curveball and do something totally different. Because if that's really saturated in the market, you still want to stand out. And I think that's another way to kind of like make sure it might not be the right thing for that brand at hand to go nostalgic and go, back in time. Another thing to watch for in branding identity is that idea of if it doesn't match the core value of what you're doing. If a brand does want to be more modern and more innovative, leaning, too heavily in retro might feel really off with that brand. So even in brand identity, maybe a certain variety or like we talked about earlier, doing a throwback and a cool limited edition retro thing for the brand could make sense for a particular promotion or a small kind of one-off. Awesome. But to be the brand identity of something, Burger King had the perfect opportunity to do this. And I think them going backwards was a perfect example of how that might be a great thing for them to use. But again, if you're going much more into something more modern and more innovative for a brand, I don't know if nostalgia is the right area for there as well. You don't want to rely on it so much that the designs start feeling stale or gimmicky because you just love the aesthetic of it. So I would try to find a way to make sure that that's not something to do for something more modern and more sleek and more innovative. The final thoughts, I think there's some big takeaways here. Nostalgia can truly be that incredible, powerful tool to use in branding and in design. I have had some really great success in using it. I will probably say I think there were a few times I pushed it and it wasn't appropriate, and the client lost maybe a little bit of kind of a trust with me, and I had to kind of turn things around. So I think it has become a bit of a default in a lot of times, but I have to be my own person to say, stop, look at the brand at hand that you're creating. Does nostalgia have any kind of room in here? If it does, have fun with it. Try to find something cool that can work in there as well. But it's not just about throwing that retro filter on something and thinking it can work. You really got to get into the weeds with it and find out what's so unique about throwing it back to something old that makes someone feel trusted again with it. Because remember, you're trying to create a connection between that brand story and the emotions that the designs you make will evoke on someone, right? So if the brand story isn't in that world, then it's not something to maybe even, explore. Test the waters, start small with, again, a limited campaign, or maybe it's a throwback on a social media post. See what happens. Like, does the audience engage with it? Does that work for the particular brand? Know your audience, make sure that the era or the style that you are referencing resonates with the target market and demographic of that brand. If it's a mismatch, maybe something not to try and do. And always remember, tell a story, because using nostalgia as a way to reinforce the brand's core value or connect with its heritage is where it will really, really be a success. If you can take that old story and there's something really cool to find in their brand story of an older company or something like that, what a wonderful way. And it's almost just a perfect lead in to trying that. So I hope this gives you some idea of inspiration for incorporating nostalgia in your work. If you've got any great examples of it as well, something maybe you've done or something you've admired from another designer or an agency or a brand that you love and follow, please be sure to either post it and mention it in some of the comments here as well. If there's anything in that retro inspired design that you love, send them our way. I'd love to see what else you guys have. It's a great little thing to try and see if it might work. We all admire it. I think it's a fun thing to see how it can work for a future project of yours. So I hope you enjoy that. Don't forget, our next episode will be all about our holiday gift guide. Michaela and I are putting together our list right now. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for something you want on your Christmas list and you want to share with other designers and listeners of the podcast, please be sure to put that into any of the comments here based on YouTube or in Spotify or on Instagram. We'll be posting an episode art for this one as well. We'd love to hear what you guys are hoping to get, or maybe you've got and you can give us a really good recommendation on to help share with other listeners. Until then, guys, have a great rest of the week. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.